Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar entitled Crisis and Intersectional Justice in Lebanon and Sri Lanka. My name's Oliver Walton. I'm a reader in international development at the University of Bath. And this webinar is marking the end of a comparative project where colleagues from the Center for Poverty Analysis in Sri Lanka and the Asfari Institute at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, together with the University of Bath, have been examining the role of organizations representing women and sexual minorities in the recent protest movements in these two countries. As many of you will know, both Lebanon and Sri Lanka have faced several severe political economic crises in recent years, and both countries have also seen large-scale sustained protest movements emerging in response, both triggered by a similar mix of factors relating to corruption, lack of political accountability, cost of living, and in both cases leading to significant political change, including resignations of leading political figures. Women and sexual minorities have borne the brunt of these crises, and organizations representing these groups have also played an important role in the wider protest movements. So in this project, we wanted to explore how crises have been experienced by women and sexual minorities, how these groups have responded to crisis, and how they've negotiated relations with the wider protest movements. So one of the key points that came out of both studies from both countries is that the impact of these crises on marginalized groups has been somewhat double-edged. So on the one hand, these conditions have undermined mobilization efforts, distracted groups from targeting structural issues. On the other hand, there's examples where they've provided opportunities and spaces for these groups to raise their profile, build new alliances, and pursue more transformational goal. Groups are those that lack legal status and lack the wider social networks that other groups have due to social exclusion and stigma. So I'm very pleased to introduce our four speakers. First of all, we have two of our research team members who will be talking about the research. First of all, we have Nadia Ismail, who's a research professional at the Center for Poverty Analysis in Sri Lanka. Nadia has degrees from the University of Colombo and University of London and works on issues including gender, minority rights, and social activism. Nadia is also a core team member of the Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group, which is a group that advocates for reforms to the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act of Sri Lanka. Lina Abu Habib is the gender director of the Asfari Institute. She works on actively linking the women's movement in Lebanon to sister activists in the region and abroad, as well as contributing to the shaping of feminist public struggles relating to women's rights and mentoring young feminists. We are then very pleased to welcome two very eminent discussants. First of all, we have Ambika Satgunanathan, who is a human rights lawyer and human rights activist. She's a former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. She also served as the legal consultant to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sri Lanka and is chairperson of the Nilan Tirul Trust. And finally, Fuad is Professor of Social Sciences and Global Health in the Department of International Health at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. He has almost 30 years of experience in research, programming, public health leadership across academia, NGOs, and government institutions. His research focuses on migration and health, with a particular emphasis on forced displacement health systems in crisis settings and multidisciplinary approaches to humanitarian challenges. So I will hand over to our speakers, and they will each speak for around 10 to 15 minutes, and this should leave us with about half an hour for questions, comments, discussions. So we will go through all the four speakers will talk first, and then we will have discussion at the end. And we are going to start with Nadia, who will be talking about the Sri Lanka research. Ambika will then respond. Then we'll move on to Lina, who will talk about the Lebanon research, and Fuad will respond, and then we'll open for questions. So I will now hand over to Nadia.
Hi, Oliver. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone, and to those joining internationally, good afternoon and even good morning, depending on where you will be joining from. So I'm just going to be using some slides for my presentation. So the findings that I will be presenting in the next few minutes are based on a country report that our team at SEPA worked on, which is based on the participation and roles of the women's movements and the gender and sexual minorities movement in Aragalaya. So for the benefit of our international audience, I will explain what Aragalaya was. So the Sri Lankan Aragalaya refers to the historic peaceful 22. It was primarily driven by the country's economic crisis characterized by severe shortages of essential goods, skyrocketing inflation and mismanagement of resources. Citizens from all walks of life united to demand accountability, transparency and systemic change, particularly targeting corruption and ineffective governance. The movement is really notable for its non-violent approach and its diverse participation, including youth, professionals, religious groups, and marginalized communities. And I inserted two pictures over here, which you can see. So the first one is some artwork that was produced in one of the protest spaces that really satirizes the political figures who were in power at that time, predominantly the Rajapaksas. And also the second picture is you can see a large crowd gathering at Gota Gogama. So the objectives of the study were to understand how political and economic crises have been experienced by marginalized women and sexual and gender minorities and returning migrant domestic workers, to understand how these groups mobilized against inadequate social protection provision during the 2022 crisis, to examine how they have negotiated relations with the wider protest movement of 2022. And so our focus will mainly be on the women's movements and the gender and sexual minorities movement. We will not be covering the migrant domestic workers in today's discussion. The research questions for the study were: how have political and economic crises been experienced by marginalized women and sexual and gender minorities? How have these groups mobilized during political and economic crisis? And how have these groups mobilized amidst inadequate social protection provision during the 2022 economic crisis? And how have they negotiated relations with the wider protest movement? So these were the research questions that we focused on. But for the purpose of my talk, I will only focus on the economic crisis and how it has been experienced by marginalized women and sexual and gender minorities, how these groups have mobilized amidst inadequate social protection provision during the 2022 economic crisis, and how these groups negotiated relations with the wider protest movement. So there's a lot of background that I cannot cover due to time constraints, and so I won't be focusing on the history of the movements and the political and economic crisis in the past that they experienced, but we are happy to have a discussion during the Q&A session about this. So these were our methods and methodology. The research employs a qualitative analysis of primary and secondary data sources. We conducted an extensive literature review and also 29 key person interviews. And we, of course, paid particular attention to ethical considerations, and we use context analysis as our method of data analysis. So really moving on to the meat of my talk. How have gender and sexual minorities experienced the crisis? So the economic crisis severely deepened LGBTQIA+ vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka. Employment insecurity rose sharply, particularly for transgender individuals who face job loss and workplace harassment. Housing instability intensified due to unaffordable rent, evictions and exclusion from state housing and legal protection. Transgender sex workers became further marginalized, lacking access to relief schemes. Healthcare access, including hormone replacement therapy (HRT), declined as it was not recognized as essential care, forcing many to prioritize survival needs. So legal and financial marginalization, compounded by criminalization and the fuel crisis, further restricted access to justice. So at large intersectional vulnerabilities based on gender identity, ethnicity, class, and occupation produce layered harms specifically for transgender individuals, Tamil LGBTQIA plus people, and those engaging in formal or sex work. So if we take a look at, how marginalized women experience the crisis, they experience the crisis in multiple intersecting ways. Domestic violence and abuse increased. Girls were pulled out of school due to rising costs. Lactating and pregnant mothers lacked adequate nutrition. And unpaid care work by women expanded significantly. Female-headed households became one of the most vulnerable groups, and we see in these households women foregoing meals to basically ensure that the children had adequate nutrition. So they lacked their nutritional needs and gave priority to children. And also, working women faced labor precarity. For instance, garment factory workers faced salary cuts and layoffs. And also, there was a rise of manpower agencies offering insecure daily paid work and really exploiting a lot of women. And we see policy restrictions on migrant workers removed to address economic downturn. So rather than removing these policies to ensure that migrant workers were empowered, it was mainly to address economic downturn. And also we see challenges faced by female activists and those participating in the protests. For instance, women activists faced arrest, detention, and surveillance. They described fear of being followed or targeted. And another thing that was highlighted was balancing activism, caregiving, and social work. It was said to be very challenging. And journalists covering protests faced tear gas, censorship, and safety risks. And also women in general faced a lot of everyday hardships, such as, the fuel, gas, and electricity shortages disrupted work, study, and care. And price hikes affected essential goods, including sanitary napkins and contraceptives. And women in general really struggle to afford food, rent, transport, and utilities, and amid job losses. So if we take a look at how these groups mobilized amidst inadequate social protection provision during the 2022 economic crisis, so if we take a look at, the gender and sexual minorities persons. So lacking state-led welfare measures, LGBTQIA plus communities in Sri Lanka mobilized through self-organized mutual aid networks, community shelters, NGOs, and diaspora support. Members provided safe housing, distributed essential supplies, and coordinated relief through trusted networks and initiatives. Digital spaces fostered emotional support and coordination, especially in the North and East. Political visibility was asserted through symbolic actions such as the equality tent at Gotago Gama, which was one of the main protest sites at the Golface Green, and pride marches during the Aragalaya. So if we take a look at how marginalized women really mobilized amidst inadequate social protection provision during the 2022 economic crisis, we see a lot of community-based solidarity. We see, in the absence of state-led social protection, we see grassroots mutual aid emerging. People shared resources, they shared food, fuel, transport. We see community kitchens, meal packs, and ration distribution initiated by women's groups and activists. And women's groups organized, launched small-scale relief initiatives despite constraints, and these were like period packs, dry rations, community meals. Of course, there were barriers to women's mobilization. The power cuts, which I mentioned previously, and the fuel and the gas shortages disrupted community work and organizing, and increased unpaid care work, limited time and emotional energy for activism. And also funding shortages halted NGO and grassroots women's organization operations. So another very important way, I would say, of how marginalized women mobilized amidst inadequate social protection during this period was their participation in Aragalaya. Aragalaya protests really became a platform for women to contest systemic failures in social protection. Despite increased domestic burdens, many marginalized women joined and sustained protest spaces. Women were visible and vocal and organized in diverse groups. And really, when it comes to, I will talk about women's participation in negotiating relations with the wider struggle in a bit. But really, we see women's movements coming into protest spaces and highlighting their issues, and we see a variety of women's movements, and this really highlights the diversity of women's movements. So with regard to how these groups negotiated relations with the wider protest movement, if we take a look at the sexual, gender, and minorities movement, during the Aragalaya, LGBTQIA+ communities joined as citizens affected by structural failures, seeking broader system change rather than focusing solely on decriminalization. Their participation, marked by the 2022 Pride March's transformation into a citizen-led protest, asserted queer visibility and political equality within the national struggle. While many experienced inclusion and acceptance, others faced hostility and perceptions of being out of place. The movement fostered new exposure of queer identities in public political spaces, but also revealed tensions, as some non-queer protesters viewed LGBTQIA+ inclusion as secondary to economic concerns. Overall, LGBTQIA+ mobilization reflected both a demand for political visibility and an assertion of shared citizenship. So if we take a look at how women's movements negotiated relations with the wider protest movement, we see that Aragalaya really challenged some of the norms of long-standing male dominance in protest cultures. Women occupied public space in very specific ways, and child corners enabled mothers' participation. Streets felt safer for young women. And also something interesting was that women were able to really confront police. For instance, if I can sort of like explain it this way, police were very hesitant to use force against men. So while force was being used against men, women were able to maintain a continuity, a non-violent continuity of the protest, because police were very hesitant to use force on women. So that was a very interesting dynamic. And also, of course, it should be acknowledged that there were attempts to expel women from protest spaces. For example, the 9th October crackdown separating parents and children, it was weaponized in media to discourage mothers' participation. And also, in relation to women's movements negotiating with the wider struggle, we see, many issues surfacing in the protest sites. And this is very significant of the diversity in women's movements that chose to join and participate with the wider struggle. For instance, Muslim women came and spoke about MMDA reform and how and the experiences after the Easter attacks. And women from the East and North spoke about, the issues they faced on the PTA and enforced disappearances. So these are basically issues that are ethnocentric and class-based in nature and really reflect the historically ethnocentric and class-based nature of the women's movements. And also there were issues that all ethnicities faced, that all marginalized women in all ethnicities face, such as, that were also brought out, that such as women workers' rights, microfinance, issues related to FTCs, migrant women, fisheries, and so on. So we really see within Aragalaya, we see issues reflective of the historical nature of the women's movements, which is class-based and ethnocentric in nature. But we also see issues brought out across ethnicities and across classes, affecting all women. Of course, there were limits to this collective feminist mobilization. For instance, males dominated co-organizing spaces. Late night meetings reduced women's presence, and sexist remarks in meetings and chats discourage women from participating fully. Women's views were often not taken very seriously, and few women leaders were in the central unit. And also, mainstream women's NGOs were largely absent and unsure how to engage. Something interesting to me was that individual female activists were able to use this space to speak, have workshops, educate, and expand networks, and gain post protest recognition. So that was very interesting to sort of see and come across in our findings. So, in conclusion, conflict legacies, ethnocentric framings, and weak cross-ethnic class solidarity within women's movements led to varied engagement with the Aragalaya rather than a unified response. In contrast, LGBTQIA plus movement effectively aligned its struggle for justice with the broader call for systemic change, using the protest space as a space for negotiation and visibility. However, without continued intersectional justice, intersectional solidarity, and structural reform, the transformative potential of this mobilization risks failing. So that is a conclusion that that we would like to end on. So basically, with regard to the participation of the LGBTQIA plus movement, we see that they were more strategic, they were more political in engaging with the wider protest, whereas with regard to the women's movements, because historically in Sri Lanka the women's movement is so diverse and also divided by class and ethnicity and just extremely diverse, it's very difficult to sort of see a very coordinated
Would like to engage with is the one on justice. This is from sort of a historical point of view. And the first group as part of this that I would like to focus on is the women former combatants, because there is quite a large section on that. And my comments are based on research that I yes, they yes, they did face stigma, but no, the majority of former women combatants did not resort to sex work, though a few did. The realities of these women were and are complex. So, intersectional, if you're using the lens of intersectional justice, it requires that these women not be viewed as only victims or collaborators, but as citizens who need to have the power to be agents of their own destiny. For this, we need to address structural, systemic, and socioeconomic factors that hamper their agency. So, intersectional justice means addressing the root causes, such as the elephant in the room, the patriarchal, violent, and historically racist state. Now, the paper attributes the stigma faced by women former combatants to what they call their activities challenging notions of traditional activities. But this is only a minor causal factor of the stigma. Yes, the militancy effected no fundamental change within the Tamil community on issues of gender equality, but once again, that is not the main reason for the stigma. The stigma was caused by the actions of the state, the government at the time. For instance, there was a perception in society that these women former combatants were or continued to be sexually abused by the armed forces several years after the end of the war because they were held at these, what they called rehabilitation camps run by the military for months after the end of the war. These women were also subjected to continued surveillance by the military for years after the end of the war, with some even being ordered to visit military camps or police stations once a week or fortnight or monthly to sign to prove they were still living in that locality. So this interaction with and connection to the military resulted in the Tamil community viewing these women as possibly dangerous. Since the women found it difficult to find employment due to, lack of qualifications or community concern that they were acting as informants for the military, hundreds of women had no choice but to work in military-run agricultural farms, which once again created the impression they might be sexually abused by the military or be acting as informants. So what we see had happened here is that the state failed in its duty and only exacerbated the challenges these women faced by subjecting them to continued surveillance. At the same time, the state encouraged the former combatants to participate in the militarization project, which some did due to threats, coercion, or lack of viable alternatives. We cannot also discuss the plight of women in the North and the East without speaking of militarization. Beyond the noticeable physical presence of the military camp, it is the military's involvement in civil administration, development activities, and commercial activities that have played a key role in normalizing militarization. The armed forces in Sri Lanka also began to engage in commercial activities. Since the army is subsidized by the state, it is able to offer goods and services for cheaper rates, thereby forcing small farmers and retailers, particularly in the north, out of business. This impacts women who, as unskilled workers, engage in day labor in the agricultural or commercial sector. For Tamil women in the post-war context, militarization and patriarchy, they function in tandem, resulting in women being faced with multi-layered forms of oppression. For instance, families that disappeared, and this group consists largely of women, are still subject to surveillance, intimidation, and harassment by the security agencies. And at the same time, they face many pressures at home and in society due to caregiving responsibilities and livelihood needs. However, even under significant conditions of oppression, they have exercised positive forms of agency by forming collectives and by providing mutual economic, social, and emotional support. Now, there was also, there is a tendency to view Tamil women's activism mainly through the lens of militancy. But contrary to this, several historical moments spurred Tamil women's activism and participation in the Tamil struggle. For instance, during the 1970s and 80s, the political activism of young women, which was sometimes, but it was not always linked to the militancy, challenged traditional understandings of the conservative nature of Tamil society. Now, Tamil women lead protests against military acquisition of land and demands for justice for the disappeared. Now, there was also some discussion about motherhood in the paper, of the Mothers' Front in the South and the North. Now, the role of motherhood in the Tamil struggle is also complex, layered, and even paradoxical. For instance, Manged Karasi, who's the wife of Amirthalingam, one of the leading politicians of the Federal Party, which was the main political party, several decades ago, participated in Satyagraha, which is peaceful protest in 1961, leaving her young son, a toddler, at home. Her failure to fulfill her socially expected duties as a mother did not escape social criticism. But at the same time, the role of Tamil mothers in the national struggle was also glorified in numerous ways. This is the paradox I was talking about. However, what was glorified was always the suffering of Tamil mothers who engaged in nonviolent protest and supported the struggle. While motherhood has been used as a tool by both Tamil political parties and armed groups, it has also resulted in politicizing the domestic sphere and blurring the boundaries between the public and the private sphere. It can be argued that women exercised transgressive agency and became political actors during a time when there was little space within the Tamil community for women's political activism. The paper argues that the Aragalaya offered opportunity for marginalized women to unify across class and ethnic divides. My question is, did it really offer that? Was it realistic to expect that outcome when civil society had not done the hard work of mobilizing and organizing at the community level? Without continued mobilizing at the community level, we cannot expect a moment, and Aragalaya is a moment, of common purpose to magically erase historical, systemic, and structural problems that are the root causes of intercommunity conflict. The big tent approach of the Aragalaya contributed to this because, for instance, we had Buddhist priests who had espoused racism, people who had supported and enabled the Rajapaksa regime. They all participated. While the right to protest of these persons is not disputed, they did not even acknowledge or accept their errors, particularly the factors that drove, their support, such as, racism, nor did they make amends. Furthermore, those who have been historically discriminated and marginalized did not feel they were part of the big tent because issues of concern to them, such as fair wages for the plantation sector workers or military acquisition of land in the north and the east, were not part of the broader slogans. There were fewer protests in the north and east with fewer people, and this is the reason for that. The apathy shown by the people in the north and the east could also be due to the south largely ignoring the struggles of the communities in the north and the east. And also, many from the South failed to view the crisis of governance we were experiencing in 2022 as intrinsically linked to the discriminatory nature of an ethnocratic Sri Lankan state. They failed to understand that the ethnocratic state facilitated and sustained systems of discrimination and marginalization of many social groups. For instance, Sinhala Buddhist nationalists have portrayed even Sinhala Buddhist women as vessels to bear children to prevent the supposedly increasing population of Muslims who were viewed or who were portrayed as threats to Sinhala Buddhist supremacy. Now we come to the LGBTIQ community. The first point I would like to make, and I see that, Varadas is also here, so he can speak to this more since he is an expert, is that, I would say that we need to rethink the use of the term sexual minorities. And this is something that I think even members of the community, some of them, many of them challenge. Also, since sexuality is on a spectrum, labeling certain groups as minorities requires rethinking, I believe. In Sri Lanka, the current state of the LGBTIQ community is cause for grave concern because there is increased hate, violence, discrimination. There is heightened labeling of the community as espousing foreign values, anti-Sri Lankan values, Western values that are not in alignment with our culture. There is organized hate speech and incitement to discrimination and violence in social media, which is enabled by certain mainstream media organizations as well. The political opposition is using the LGBTI community as a tool to attack the government. And not surprisingly, religious leaders are fueling it and are weaponizing it to oppose progressive reforms such as sexuality education and decriminalizing abortion. Now, my general points. When we speak of justice, we must speak of the law. Law reform alone cannot address gender inequities, as the implementation of reforms can be subverted by patriarchal practices, particularly during times of crisis. Now, the law, which we view as a vehicle of empowerment for women, is also impacted by ethno-religious factors, which can inhibit the responses of women and their reluctance to support initiatives for legal reform. Women from communities that are under siege, who might have been subjected to extensive state control due to their ethnicity or religion, may take refuge in the private spheres of their communities. An intersectional justice analytical lens must also take note of violence. Historically, in Sri Lanka, the structural violence unleashed by the state has been ignored. Violence is normalized and has seeped into public institutions, including those that are mandated to provide protection and remedies for rights violations, such as the police and the justice sector. Institutions in which violence and abuse are embedded will not be able to stem impunity or hold perpetrators accountable. Instead, they have become enablers and perpetrators of the continuum of abuse to which citizens are subjected. We also find that some form of violence elicits public outrage, while some does not. For instance, the civilian casualties and violations during the last stages of the war in 2009 were viewed as acceptable. Therefore, society is also complicit to some extent in normalizing violence against certain groups, such as Tamils, Muslims, and LGBTIQ persons. So to hold perpetrators accountable, we must be able to hold public institutions that are mandated to provide remedies accountable. This has been virtually impossible in Sri Lanka for many reasons. And I think this is something that the paper, it could go into more, if particularly, since we're speaking about intersectional justice, because public institutions are extremely important. The other is, of course, the relationship between the citizen and the state. In Sri Lanka, the relationship between the citizen and the state has been damaged by the armed conflict and decades of repressive rule. This is particularly acute where Tamils and Muslims are concerned, and also communities like the LGBTIQ community. A strong social contract is imperative for successful institutional transformation. Hence, if reform efforts are to succeed, both structural reforms as well as an ideational shift are required. Now, this is not an easy process. It's a long-term process and a painful one, but a necessary one. The other is that the social contract is also linked to identity, but there is no common Sri Lankan identity around which all citizens can coalesce, because the Sri Lankan identity is often conceived as one in which the diverse and plural nature of Sri Lanka is erased, an identity modeled largely on a Sinhala Buddhist identity. The paper says that the inability to organize a movement from the Aragalaya was due to the ethnocentric nature of women's issues, which demand an ethnocentric response. I argue that it requires a response that addresses structural, systemic, and socioeconomic factors that have entrenched discrimination and impunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambika, for those really insightful comments. So without further ado, we will now hand over to Lena, who will talk about the Lebanon research.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I will take much less time. I will start first by just outlining the context when we did this rapid research. So last year, around this time, October, November, we were going through the Israeli war on Lebanon, which was pretty brutal and quite destructive. And it was exactly during this time when we carried out two parallel rapid research. One was looking at because of the fact that the previous government that was in charge during that war, because the government was mostly dysfunctional and aid to around 1.4 million displaced overnight was really late to come. Civil society actually moved immediately to a humanitarian emergency action, and we wanted to capture how were civil society organizations, feminist organizations, queer folks organizations, disability-led organizations, migrant organizations were dealing with the huge humanitarian concern without themselves being organizations that had the skills or the resources to do so. So that was happening. And at the same time, we did this, again, I really want to insist that it was a rapid research happening as the bombs were dropping. So it was that kind of context. So what we wanted to see, and the purpose of this parallel research was to look at the overlapping political, economic, and security crises in Lebanon and how these were experienced in real time by marginalized groups. And we particularly focused on migrant women, domestic workers, and LGBTQI plus communities. So these were our groups. This was a qualitative research. We did 15 key informant interviews. We did 5 focus group discussions in addition to ethnographic documentation. Again, I really want to emphasize it was in real time. It was as the war was taking place. There were many limitations, of course, one due to the security context. We were really limited geographically to urban areas. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to basically have a wide geographical coverage. So that's one thing, and also a limitation in time and scope of the research. So we know very well how compact the research coverage was. I just want to go through some of the core findings and then maybe leave it to my colleague, Dr. Fuad, to comment on these particular findings. These were really interesting interviews because they were conversations with activists from these two kind of communities, let me say. And one important core finding was, sorry, that's a state of urgency that limits them in terms of their organizing and that keeps them and their communities in surviving mode. That's a summary of what people understood by a crisis. People also talked about what the ways in which they define marginalization. And interestingly, they didn't see marginalization as an individual problem. They saw it more as a structural problem. And this is where I said I was going to back to vulnerable. People they rejected the fact being called vulnerable, which in Arabic is hash. It was mostly an understanding, and maybe this is linked again, as I said, it's a rapid research. Maybe this is linked again to the fact that for the most part they were activists, that this is actually about unequal power relations. This was about systemic inequality within the legal, economic, sectarian, and also racial system. And there was really clarity amongst the activists we spoke with on how does this marginalization reproduces itself within these various layers. And in relation to marginalization, what we saw and noted and heard was that actually, contrary to various definitions on vulnerability, migrant women, domestic workers, and queer individuals actually exhibit and show agency through the creation of various forms of under the radar informal networks which engage them in mutual aid. And actually they do challenge the ways in which they portrayed by institutions as just passive recipients of assistance or waiting for assistance to happen. The ways in which, and we saw this also in our parallel study, which we were doing with organizations rather than with individuals, that actually one way to counter a situation of marginalization or vulnerability was actually to move into immediate informal forms of networking. Which is actually leads to the different forms of informal support, which we found were very much relational and which actually were key for the survival of these communities, the kind of mutual care, but also what we called collective healing, or what was identified as collective healing. And an interesting finding was that these informal networks were outside your regular, very well-known, very visible, to a large extent, quite well-resourced NGO structures. And these were actually way more responsive to identifying and delivering support immediately rather than going through lengthy channels. However, this might, it's not that it might, it is positive and empowering, but it's at the same time, there was also evident fragmentation of this solidarity, fragmentation in terms of it's really within silos and subgroups and truly divisions that were, I would say, exacerbated and amplified during the conflict. So, in a sense, people would use an understanding of intersectionality, but actually its application was problematic because people remained silos within communities. But actually, there was a lot of negative vision of the ways in which service provision was happening and the ways in which service provision was systematically replacing, undermining, and even sabotaging political organizing. And at the level of these individual activists, it was felt that using terms like resilience or emergency response or immediate response really undermine and depoliticize the discourse around structural violence, and as usual, it puts the onus and the responsibility on the marginalized community. From the observations, there were some of the key observations that our colleague pulled out, which is there was a rupture in international knowledge connection and knowledge transfer. There was clearly a gap, and that's where this research and also the other parallel research we were doing, we feel is important, because there was a lack of documentation and archiving of what is happening. This was not, it was not seen by almost everybody as something that needs to be done now during the war. The whole issue of, I talked about silos a bit before, and siloing was also linked to gatekeeping, and that gatekeeping might have been also prompted by, thinking about access to resources or even difficulties around sharing resources, etc. And people reported a lot of tensions between these forms of informal networks, informal solidarity networks, and then well-structured organizations, civil society with frameworks, with funding, etc. So that this tension, which I should say existed before the war, but was heightened and amplified when the war was happening. And perhaps to talk about a final, what I think is a major finding is the ways in which different groups navigate a crisis differently. And it's not disconnected from what I was just saying in terms of the tension, but the impact of access to networks, access to media, access to institutional allies, And all of this was really incredibly important to maintain this political momentum, to maintain this activism during the war. However, speaking with LGBTQI individuals, trans folks, and especially trans sex workers and migrant domestic workers, this was way more problematic because the legal restrictions remained there. The hierarchies within the groups, whether gender-based hierarchies or racial hierarchies, were a serious constraints. And also many of these groups were outside any eligibility to funding, and probably one of the factors that made them outside any form of eligibility to serious funding in time when you need a lot of resources for survival is the fact that they were informal, not registered, and do not meet all of these requirements, despite the fact, and this was the main finding from our two pieces of research, this one and the one with civil society, that everybody we spoke with was in a situation where they shifted entirely from what they do in general, whether it's advocacy, whether it's knowledge production, whether it's community solidarity, etc., to looking at immediate survival needs. And I think this brings us to the end to some thoughts, some food for thoughts, which is how do we communicate about marginalized communities? How does the international community communicate about marginalized communities, and the pervasive view about the ways in which they are passive? But what we have seen is the ability to strategically navigate dangerous systems, restrictive system, while at the same time being blocked by different kinds of structural inequalities. And one of the really hard-hitting finding, again, not surprising, but it was evident, was the fact that there's an issue, there's a problem, there's a rupture between movements, between solidarity movements. The siloing that I was talking about is definitely detrimental, particularly in this context. I mean, the context of everybody being enduring an active war hasn't seemed to be useful in terms of breaking the silos or bringing different movements together. And I will end by saying that when this was happening, the major crisis in funding had not happened yet. And thinking forwards, what would happen now if any sort of major humanitarian crisis happens, and there's really now we're now in a completely different, in a worse context in terms of availability of resources or availability of funding, and that's something that it's quite concerning, because we are aware of a context where this kind of aggression and conflict is recurring. It has never been resourced, which also means that I mean, given the gaps that I talked about in the beginning, and the fact that most of us think that it's impossible to archive and document and collect data and storage this when a context like this is unfolding, it more and more leads us towards the importance of longitudinal studies and a much more deeper investigation of communities which we feel are at the receiving end of oppression, multiple oppression, and multiple forms of discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. That was great. So we'll now hand over to Fuad for a response about the research and the paper.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Lina, for presenting the findings. And I, to be honest, I like it very much. So I'll try to have my comments here as sort of questions, to raise more ideas, for the future than just like putting comments. So let me start that this report makes a significant and timely contribution to understanding the experiences of marginalized population in Lebanon across overlapping crises. One of its strongest achievements is its refusal to take concepts such as crises, vulnerability, and even intersectionality for granted. Instead, it interrogates how these terms operate in political discourse, humanitarian practice, and everyday life. Rather than treating participants' statements as simple testimonies, it examines how language constructs power relations and shapes possibilities for action. Its attention to emerging forms of informal support, SNAD, queer mutual aid, decolonial listening, offers valuable insight into local context-specific strategies of survival and resistance. These are contributions that should be more systematically integrated into scholarly policy and the humanitarian conversation. While this report presents rich and meaningfully findings, several questions, as I mentioned, that arise that may help deepen the discussion and guide future work. One is about the conceptual clarification. The report insightfully critiques crises as a depoliticized concept, which I strongly agree. Yet it continues to rely on this terminology throughout the analysis, which raises the question about what alternative conceptual vocabulary can we use to describe ongoing structural violence without reproducing the language and timelines imposed by donor or humanitarian actors. If crisis is permanent, like the situation in Lebanon, cumulative and normalized, then perhaps Lebanon is not in a crisis, but rather an entrenched condition of political abandonment and structural harm. How might renaming this condition shift our understanding of agency, responsibility, and justice? Similarly, the rejection of term vulnerable in favor of disempowered, which is, again, it's another great suggestion, but highlight this issue, highlight the importance of language. But how can this shift influence policy frameworks that are deeply invested in vulnerability categories? Can this empowerment be translated into programmatic design, resource allocation, and legal reform? On methodological limitation and opportunities. Although I acknowledge that Lena just mentioned about that sort of limitation given, the war by then, but this sort of limitation raises an important issue on how do experiences of crisis differ for marginalized population in rural or semi-rural region such as Beqa or southern Lebanon, where there were difficulties to conduct the research by then. So where the state in these two districts, where the state presence is different and community dynamics vary. Expanding geographic coverage may reveal different forms of marginalization and different forms of organizing. The researcher positionality, particularly concerns expressed by migrant domestic workers, prompt another question on how can future studies prioritize co-production, where marginalized groups participate not only as respondent, but as co-researcher, co-designers, and co-authors. This shift may help reduce extractive dynamics and produce findings more aligned with the community's priorities. Additionally, the absence of collective memory, archives, and intergenerational documentation in the data is striking. What does this silence tell us? It might indicate not only a lack of documentation practices, but also deep fatigue fragmentation, and the erosion of institutional memory within movement. This raises a broader question about how to build and sustain memory infrastructures capable of connecting past struggles with the future organizing. An issue on intersectionality and NGO ecosystem. The report critiques the deployment of intersectionality as a new liberal branding exercise rather than a transformative framework. Then we may need to think about how can NGOs operationalize intersectionality in a way that redistributes power rather than reinforces silos, as mentioned by Lena. If marginalized groups are told to fight in the corner with limited funding and narrow mandates, is intersectionality being used in service of justice or in service of donor fragmentation? Moreover, the findings on gatekeeping, particularly within movement themselves, suggest that intersectionality cannot function without internal accountability. What mechanisms could movement create to ensure transparency, resource sharing, and collective strategizing across identities and sectors? On the agency and informal network and the limits of formal structures. The report powerfully reframes migrant domestic workers as active agents rather than passive victims. They navigate NGO systems, build informal networks, and mobilize around personal and collective needs. But their agency remains structurally constrained by immigration policies, racial hierarchies, and the kafala system. Then it's also worth to ask on how can policy and advocacy efforts support the form of agency that already exists rather than imposing external structures that may not align with community priorities. Should donors and NGOs shift resources toward informal network, which is usually unusual, such as mutual aid and ISNAD that mentioned in the report, even if they fall outside the traditional project-based models? One of the other issue about these the fragmented imaginaries and the political futures. One of the most profound insight in the report is the absence of a shared vision of Lebanon future. Marginalized groups do not articulate a unified political project, partly due to exhaustion, partly due to structural divisions along class, race, sect, and nationalities. So, what does it mean to build solidarity in a context where groups inhabit different realities and different Lebanons? Without a shared political imaginary, movements may continue to focus on survival rather than transformation. So to almost end up with that, so the report suggested that Lebanon marginalized communities operate in a landscape marked by structural abandonment, donor-driven fragmentation, and internal divisions. Yet they also create powerful systems of mutual support, solidarity, and resistance. Understanding this duality, structural constraint, and everyday agency is essential for designing policies and interventions that uplift rather than overshadow local practices. And I will end up here with a sort of a forward-looking questions. What would it take to move from fragmented survival strategies toward a collective, politically grounded movement for justice that include migrant workers, queer communities, refugees, and other marginalized group. This, report brings us closer to answering these questions, but it also shows how much more remains to be explored. And thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Fuad, for engaging with the work and for your comments. So I think now perhaps we should return to the initial speakers in case they wanted to respond to the comments raised. We also have some additional comments raised in the chat from our colleague Varadas Tyagaraja, who's raised a number of questions regarding the Aragalia and particularly queer movements evolution there. And then we also have a question which I think is responding directly to Lena's presentation. So if that's okay, Nadia, could I ask you if you have any response to Ambika's comments, and perhaps if you've been able to see the questions from Vara? Not sure. Maybe not sure if Nadia is there. Lena, I don't know if you wanted to have a quick response.
Yes. I'm going to respond to Tala's question, which I think is important because, look, the humanitarian and development sector has developed its own, as you know, Oliver, and definitely as Fuad knows, that would kind of justify, describe, and help in monitoring their intervention. So what does marginalization mean? What does vulnerability mean? And, I've seen throughout the year, and probably Fuad as well, the ways in which this is measured to justify how much a certain person in a particular context is worth in terms of help and support. So you'd be surprised at the metrics that are used under marginalization and what does vulnerability mean. And so in practice, the ways in which these are used, it depends by whom they are used. And when they are used in a context of humanitarian aid, etc., it's a typology of who gets what, to which extent, and for how long. And I think what is happening at the level of people on the ground is really a resistance to this, first of all, to this classification that is, in my view, incredibly disempowering and problematic, because people are not themselves defining where they are and what do they need and what are their priorities. Somebody else is using different metrics that are applicable across the board. And therefore, that's why I think most people were really rejecting being identified as marginalized or identified as being vulnerable. And just to continue on this, I think once we see the ways in which people who are described as marginalized and vulnerable are navigating an incredibly brutal context, we would be changing our minds in terms of the typology that has been imposed. So let me just finish by saying I think this brings us, in addition to the critique that Fuad was making, this brings us to really the need to brutally address and challenge these categories that put people next to what is it that they are deserving of at this moment in time in terms of immediate material needs.
Great, thank you, Lena. Nadia, I'm not sure if you're online or able.
Hi.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Okay.
Oliver, so Kalara and I, both of us are here.
Okay.
Kalara would like to jump in on Varadas's first question, so she'll speak on that.
In relation to how women's group and queer groups interact within the protest spaces, I would say, so in our study, we looked at it it's as two different sections, right? So women's group and also queer groups. So we didn't necessarily look into how they interact within the protest space, but there were certain intersecting points. For instance, if you look at the dynamics, whether it's collaborative or conflictual, I would say there were both. I mean, both sort of instances could be seen. For instance, so you had members of queer communities, but also women from different walks of life. So depending on that, I would say whether they whether within the groups, women's groups that were there, whether they sort of collaborative or was conflictual with the queer community within the protest side, I would say it was depending on their sort of grouping, I would say. And it's difficult to sometimes also differentiate between the women's group and also the queer groups, because there were people who were sort of like queer feminists. So in that sort of instances, it was difficult to sort of differentiate and say how did they collaborate, or there was a conflictual situation emerging at the Aragade, I would say.
Nadia, did you want to respond to anything that Ambika raised?
In terms of any specific points that she raised, as in
Nothing. Well, just if you had any general comments, but no problem if not. The other point that Vera has raised in his question is about the butterfly for democracy. So I don't think the other participants can see, but he's asking in what ways can queer agency be contextualized within broader democracy movements, and how do they challenge dominant political narratives is crucial. Perhaps a note on queer groups' agency and we wanted to draw attention to, these sometimes like hidden forms of agency, I suppose, that we see marginalized groups, displaying in the midst of these wider protest movements. I think that was, what we are interested in, and we've collected some examples where we have seen some shifts and some positive outcomes there. But at the same time, I think, as Ambika very much highlighted, these are very constrained forms of agency, and there's great limits to this. So I think it's always important to contextualize that within those wider limitations. And I think some of these legacies, particularly from conflict and the kind of post-colonial history in Sri Lanka, have been discussed in the paper, but maybe that is something that we need to slightly reframe in terms of the kind of transformational potential of some of these movements. And yeah, in terms of Fuad's comments, I think, yeah, it's definitely something for us more to think about, particularly in terms of how do we, what alternative terminology do we use in relation to a lot of these issues? I think that's something important for us to reflect on as we take this forward. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, I don't know if there's any other comments from the participants. If anyone had any further questions. Oh, there was a question again from Vera, about the Black July and Mulavaikel commemorations, and whether that offers a glimpse of solidarity between different women's groups. I don't know if that was anything to the Sri Lanka team, if that came up in any of your interviews, or if there was any discussion about that.
From the interviews, this was not something that came about. But of course, on a personal level, having seen the interactions at Aragalaya, just being in Sri Lanka myself, I
let me compare it. Again, that's the internet in Lebanon. So let me compare this to a major crisis that occurred in 2020 after the August 4th blast, because you had this. Of course, it was a one-time event, but it was a really devastating. But I think you were in Beirut, so none of us has forgotten this. So it was a devastating blow, and it was basically affected particular areas around the site of the blast. And also, it so happened that the areas that were affected were basically where, on the one hand, where the poorest lived. They were like conglomeration of, migrant workers, also queer communities, and for queer communities and for trans people and for sex workers, these were not only the areas where they lived, but these were their livelihoods as well. So, like Mar Mikhail, like etc. And what happened as a result is that you end up having exactly the same community be dropping off from the radar of any known aid mechanism. So the queer community developed something, and I don't know if you remember, Fuad, a mutual aid, and it was called Yalla Care, which a number of queer organizations came together specifically to be able to support sex workers who became homeless and without work, trans people, queer people, and especially with the destruction of pubs and bars where people were working. That and also shelter. And also if what also and what something really good that they did was that this was documented. This is one of the few documentation of how they got together and how they leveraged their getting together, but it was a silo. And then another silo was also, to some extent, migrant workers, because also of this, they're sharing the space and therefore being affected almost equally in that space. So in a sense, what we're seeing is a repetition of existing silos that, it reproduces themselves in a case of major crisis and where actually, and actually this is an important question. So you have a repetition of this situation, and in this repetition, what is also repeated is that you have communities that are more or less isolated, that are more or less under the radar, that are more or less suffering because of stigma or because of taboo, etc. But yet you don't see the breaking of the silos in these moments. We haven't seen it during or after post August blast, and I don't think we have seen it I don't think we have seen it during the Israeli war of last October and November. And the sad thing is that at least now we have some data, we have some stories collected, we have some information. But if I want to go back to the last big war, like in 2006, we hardly have anything. Honestly, you go back to 96, there's nothing. You go back to so what I'm trying to say is we keep seeing these trends repeat themselves and the silos remain. Yes, they are impacted by the politics and the policies of aid, but we're not seeing these silos come together or break for that matter.
That's great. Thank you, Lina. So we don't have any more questions. So I think probably we should just draw the meeting to a close. But I did want to say thank you to everyone who's come along and attended and participated, and particular thanks to Fuad and Ambika, who I know had to leave. But yeah, we do really appreciate your engagement with the project and your great comments. And also like to thank Lina and Nadia and Kalara also for diving in at the end there. So thanks everyone, and yeah, we will. I think this meeting will be recorded. Is that correct? So the recording should be shared as well.
With
Yes.
little interruptions due to internet.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully we'll still get most of the recording there.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank
you.
Bye.
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 Thanks.